Welcome to the Education Innovators podcast. I'm Eric Byron, and it is my privilege to host this show where I get to talk to folks from all over the world who are education thought leaders and innovators. We'll hear inspiring stories from educators, EdTech founders, AI experts, and others who are fearlessly innovating and delivering unique learning experiences. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. In this episode, we're going to talk to Will Smith. He's the head of Bedales School in England. And Bedales is another example of a unique school with a very distinct, almost not radical, but it's a progressive approach to learning. And I'm going to start with a little snippet from a promotional video they did because I want you to get a taste for the school. Right? There's a beautiful setting and environment and a very vibrant school community. So enjoy that. This is just a piece of it. There's a link to the full 5-minute video in the show notes. Enjoy.
But it's definitely the most important part is the people you meet here.
To come here and to completely be free is something that I'm not going to forget. It has really helped me to genuinely figure out who I am as a person.
I just think I was so lucky to have had the opportunity to go to school here. It's pretty cool.
All of your travelling all on your own. Are you going to tomorrow or are you heading home?
All right. Welcome to the Education Innovators podcast. I'm Eric Byron, and I am joined today by Will Goldsmith. He is the head of Bedales School in Petersfield, England. The school was founded by John Badley all the way back in 1893. It's a private school offering an alternative to the GCSE courses and assessments. The school has been described as disciplined but not rule-bound. There's no uniforms, and the students and teachers call each other by first name. Will joined Bedales in April 2021 as the deputy head of academics and was acting head by September of that same year. So he's been head of the school for about 4 years. Welcome, Will. Did I get that intro right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, spot on, Eric, and thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Good. Yeah, I'm excited about this. This should be some fun. All right, let's jump right in. So, well, first let's establish something. So, Bedales is a pretty prestigious school, right? There's been some famous alumni, and I think I read somewhere that like Boris Johnson's kids, attend the school. Is that correct?
I think certainly we are the kind of place which will always attract people who are looking for something which is both high quality, but also something you can't necessarily find in either the kind of public sector, the state sector, or necessarily even in other independent schools. And I think particularly one of the things you're going to find that's of a special interest is that kind of confluence between creativity and academia. And I think that balance between the two is something that really draws people in because they can see that there's something quite special there.
Yeah. So is that what attracted you to the school? How did you end up at Bedales?
So I ended up here because I was at my previous school, Latimer Upper in London, looking at curriculum reform, and Bedales was the obvious place to come and see a place that had already done that, had already progressed on that journey. And so I came, and the curriculum was fascinating and continues to be so. For an educator, just that kind of freedom was very exciting. But it was the whole package, and particularly meeting the people and the students and seeing how they were able to engage with me as a random teacher who'd come from another school without any of the constraints that you sometimes find, either in terms of nervousness or sometimes in terms of excessive kind of scripted politeness that sometimes you find when schools maybe have expectations of young people which channel their behavior in a certain way. I suppose the other thing to say is from that point, it was love at first sight. And I waited for about 3 years for the job to come up, or the first job to come up. I went to the British Library and read everything I could about the school, and a lot has been written about it. And the more I learned, the more I just felt that I absolutely had to sit tight and wait for a job opportunity to come up.
Interesting. So you've used this word progressive and kind of evolving. So tell me more. I'm really curious, what is so different about the curriculum there and the approach that was so intriguing and attractive?
I mean, I think if you look at the history of Bedales, then you will see a school which, in some ways, has been moving with developments in education over the time it's been in existence, so more than 130 years. It's a really fascinating place to understand how education has evolved, not only in this country, but more broadly in kind of advanced industrial economies, or now post-industrial. And I think that, when we talk about progressive, what we mean here, and this may be a different definition to in other parts of the world, it's less a kind of overtly political statement. It's more about us wanting to be at the forefront of progress in education. And so we're thinking about, what does the evidence tell us today? What is society today, and what will society be in the next decade or so? And therefore, what should education be in order to serve young people the best possible way?
Okay. So what's the best possible way, Will?
Well, that's a
At the
constantly evolving process, and I think again that sense of Bedales, but all educators should, if they have the right freedoms and the right kind of trust bestowed upon them, should always be looking for growth. And if you're in the learning business, then you need to be a learner yourself, and you need to be interested in growth and to embrace that on every level, whether it be you personally as an educator, whether it be thinking about your institution. So I think, there are certain things that we need to take into account. I mean, before I kind of talk about maybe a couple of things, it is always important also, though, to make sure that you are trying to achieve a balance between innovation and working with things that work well. And excessive amounts of change are not good for any institution. And certainly when you're working with young people who only have one shot at any particular kind of stage in their educational career, generally, then you need to get it right. But I think if you look at the moment that we are in as a country and as a world, then we're still getting to grips with the information revolution, the internet revolution. There's a lot of conversation about artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence is merely just part of all those two things I've just mentioned. It's in itself, AI has been around for decades. It's advanced a little bit more, and quite a lot more, and is very powerful. But again, to kind of buy into it wholesale, to think that it's some kind of panacea or some kind of existential threat, I think both of those extreme polarities are unhelpful when formulating approaches to education. But certainly what the information revolution does is it problematizes the 19th century teacher as repository of information, who then needs to pass it over to their students, who then just absorb it, or it's decanted into their minds. We have a democratization of access to information. So alongside knowledge learning, which is an essential part of brain development, you also need to help young people learn skills in terms of how to access knowledge in this different paradigm, how to filter knowledge, how to evaluate knowledge. And that is something which cannot be done solely by a teacher. It must be devolved to an individual level. You'll also see an increasing amount of personalization, although a school like Bedales is in a great position to already be there, because we operate on a scale where we know all of our students as individuals. That's the reason why we operate on a first name terms, and why we don't want these kind of potentially kind of autocratic or anonymizing kind of forces that you find, particularly in larger schools, where by dint of being a larger unit, it becomes depersonalized.
Right.
And I think hopefully repersonalizing education from where it has got to in the last kind of 15 years, I think is an important thing. Luckily for us, that isn't very difficult. I think also our understanding of brain development, particularly now we're seeing the impact of things like social media and mobile phones on all human beings, but particularly on brain development in young people, then we know that, again, balance is important. I think complete prohibition, again, is perhaps, again, a reaction rather than the right balance. But at the same time, we know we need to find that balance between virtual and real. And we also need to make sure that we are thinking about the right age at which young people, for example, have high stakes assessments. And we know that at 16, statistically, there is a maturity gap between boys and girls on average. And therefore, to put them through a high stakes exam, which is going to determine their future, is unwise based on what we know from neuroscience and particularly focus on adolescent neurodevelopment. 18, though, statistically is a time at which that gap has narrowed. And therefore, that is where particularly the GCSE system is out of kilter with scientific evidence about brain development.
Yeah. Interesting. So help me with the scale. How many students do you have there?
So we're a 3 to 18 school, sort of separated into 3 separate parts. So a pre-prep, a prep, and a senior. The senior school, which starts age 13, so year 9 in UK kind of language or English language, is approximately 500 students. And then 200 in the prep, and then 100 in the pre-prep. So you've got a kind of slight gradation in terms of scale, but we're very much capped at that 500 and capped at the 800 overall, so that we can maintain a sense of community across the whole campus. And that sense of connectedness is one of the things which, again, means that we don't have to rely on automatic modes of control. That doesn't mean we don't have rules. We have just as many rules as any other school, actually, but it's more that we don't have to follow them in a robotic way. And we can spend a lot more time talking to young people from an educational perspective about the implications of what happens when they step over a boundary or where they have a negative impact on other people within the community.
Yeah. What's an example? This is all great, by the way. I'm just absorbing it. So individualized learning. Do the students have freedom to kind of decide what courses they're going to take or when they're going to take them, or, how much time they're going to spend on a particular subject? How much freedom is there for the students?
So the freedom is a gradated one. And in some ways, we don't totally reject some of the existing paradigms. So, for example, our students take A-levels in their final 2 years at the senior school. And that's the standard kind of program in many ways that you'd find in other schools. And for us, that specialization is helping our students go on a journey of self-discovery and particularly exploring what their academic passions are. Because in doing so, when they leave us at the end of the senior school, then they have a really solid foundation on which to then kind of either go to university, which is where kind of 99% of our students go on to, or if they are going straight into work, then something which is going to kind of carry through. And generally, dropout rates for our students from university are significantly lower than the independent school average, for example, just because they have a really secure sense of where they're going. Or if they don't by the time they're 18, then they will often take a year off before then knowing where they're going to go. So the amount of choice increases as they come through in terms of subject choices. So in the first year, it's a very broad one. But then at the end of the first year, they make choices which then narrow it slightly down to about 10 different subjects. Again, very similar to the number of GCSE subjects you've got. The difference, though, is the assessment in those kind of 2 years from 14 to 16 is much more a balance between continuous assessment and terminal assessment. There are some GCSEs in the mix, and there will continue to be 2 GCSEs in that mix. We look, for example, to the Canadian system, especially in places like British Columbia, where they do a statewide numeracy and literacy assessment, which we think is appropriate to help young people understand kind of where they are and to be able to make comparisons, especially if there are transitions in schools, but that's all you really need. And then obviously for A-level, they're choosing 3 or 4, and then that takes them through into especially the UK university system, which is more narrow than some other university systems, particularly in places like the States or continental Europe. So I suppose that's the kind of structure within each of the courses, and all the way down to the beginning of the school, even the 3-year-olds, though, when it comes to the kind of day-to-day of their learning, then we build in a lot of choice. So we will always work hard to find ways in which there are kind of options that students can choose, or flexibility in terms of how they do things, and also a sense of a co-curated learning experience rather than just something which is done to them or something which they just comply to.
Interesting. The environment there, I think, I saw some pictures, I think even a video of the campus, also seems to me, I mean, it's beautiful, right? It's very conducive to this kind of relaxed environment. How much does that play into it, do you think, in terms of, as opposed to kind of a traditional classroom, gray walls and chairs lined up in rows? How much does the environment help support the methodology, if you will?
It's a huge part of it, and it's been a huge part of the school since its founding. The school, just for a few years when it was initially founded, was on a different site, but in about 1900, we kind of moved here and established a new campus on what was and still is a farm. And while we are not an agricultural college, our aim is not to develop young farmers going out into the world, although very occasionally some people do. The reason why we have that connection to the natural world and the cycles of nature, and particularly a profound understanding of where food comes from and how it's made and how it's grown, is that our students can kind of balance their head world with the hand world. We talk a lot about head, heart, hand, a phrase which was coined by Pestalozzi in Switzerland in the early 19th century. It's a phrase that we used a lot and I think helped kind of bring to a broader audience, especially in the English-speaking world. But that sense of trying to counterbalance the cerebral with the manual is a really important way of essentially developing self-regulation and self-equilibrium. So we have a 120-acre site which still operates as a small holding precisely because we know that's a really good counterbalance. It's a good counterbalance also just for sort of mental health as well. Teenagers particularly can sometimes get kind of caught up in their own kind of intense psychodramas. And so to engage in the drama of the lambing season, where lambs are born or sometimes stillborn, or where they're born and then they don't make it beyond a week, is something which really helps them kind of put things into perspective. There is also, though, I think, a sense of space here. And you talked about relaxed. I would talk more about calm. This is a very purposeful place. Students are very busy here. There isn't, you might see in a break time kids relaxing around the campus, but actually, other than that, they are extremely busy, and their days are very full. But in having space, in having particularly a lot of connection with the natural world, then again, that just helps them self-regulate better. And it also reminds ourselves of our place in the natural world. And that links also to the importance of sustainability for our school. And that's, again, always been important. And particularly now, that's another strand of 21st century education, which is even more important. And we are working on developing a sustainability super curriculum, which goes all the way from 3 to 18 at the moment.
Yeah. Well, you stole a little bit of my next question because I was going to ask you specifically about that head, hand, heart approach. So you got into it a little bit, but one of the things, kind of a follow-on question I had there was also about community. So I noticed that within the description of what head, hand, and heart means, community was like 2 of the 5 focuses there. So talk to me a little bit about that and why that's so important. And particularly, you comment in the website on developing international awareness of the school as being important. So talk to me about community.
So I think when you're thinking about the purposes of education, there are sometimes people who take a very narrowly utilitarian view, that you are learning information and skills which will then help you in the world of work. Now, that is an important part of education. Your contribution to society is an essential part of any good education. But certainly here at Bedales, we definitely take a broader perspective, which is it's not just about preparing for the world of work or to be useful. It's a more broader sense of preparation for participation in society. So we are helping develop future citizens who will make a positive contribution to the world, be positive members of society, and make a positive contribution to the planet and maybe the universe more generally. There is also that sense of wanting to develop the person for themselves and for them to be kind of exploring and developing their own potential in a more abstract sense. And that is essentially a moral duty that we feel very strongly. Now, if we are preparing students, particularly to go out into the world and particularly for society, what we need to create here is, as much as possible, as many aspects of society in microcosm. So we focus particularly on community so that students understand their place within society, here on a increasingly large scale, so initially 100, then 200, then 500. But also, obviously, we do a lot of trips out. We talk a lot about our place in our local community, in our regional community, in our national and in our international community. We have students who come from all around the world. Many of them, the families will relocate for the junior school, and then other students will come in for the senior school part and be boarders and fly in. We particularly have a strong kind of intake from North America, for example, where I think there are a lot of kind of shared values in terms of what we're doing, but we can offer stuff that you don't necessarily find as much in many kind of secondary schools in the United States in terms of that kind of specialization and that academic focus, which is really exciting for students who've got at least a nascent sense of their own kind of passions. So in everything we're doing, we're constantly helping students develop lots of different skills, whether it be a skill in philosophy or mathematics, or whether it be a skill in terms of how they interact with people or how a rules-based society operates effectively. Now, there are lots of challenges in the 21st century to a rules-based order. And while it feels quite fragile at the moment, at the same time, we still profoundly believe that that's the way in which human beings can peacefully coexist. And so we're trying to develop those skills here. And that does mean both, connecting your individual self to a collective whole, but it also is about kind of understanding the responsibility that comes from being within a community. And our motto as a school, which is a slightly old-fashioned one, but still one that fits today, is the work of each for the weal or the benefit of all. And so we're constantly switching between an individual focus and then a communal focus. And if that's our motto, then community is central to how this place is successful.
Yeah. A little bit of Star Trek there, right? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? Spock.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's great. So does this also include kind of community service stuff? So do you guys go out and feed people or help in the community in some way?
So service starts here and radiates out. So we have an expectation, even for our students in the school, that they contribute to the operational running of the school. One of the things sometimes that's dangerous, especially in a fee-paying environment, is that there's a pressure in that paradigm for us to cater for or to the students, because obviously there is a fee-paying element to that. But we work very hard to resist that. We want, obviously, our students to have an excellent education. But for us, it is vital, almost more so because of the privilege that they have, that they participate in just the day-to-day running of the school. Because they need to understand, especially wherever they go after school, that any organization, any society, any kind of complex business or charity relies on lots of different people to make it happen. And if just one of those people doesn't or isn't able to do that, then the whole thing falls apart. And there is therefore a sense in which we need to be aware of all of those things. So, we had an event last night to thank the people who are involved in raising funds for our scholarship, our bursary program. So our bursary program basically funds students who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to come here. And last night we heard from one of the students who's a current beneficiary. She's a Ukrainian refugee who joined us after the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And she was just telling our donors and our supporters what that experience had meant for her. Rather than having staff help her that evening, because there were some snacks and there were some drinks, just to kind of refresh our guests, it was actually our head students who were doing that. So they were handing out the food, they were helping out alongside members of staff as well. But the idea is that we are all doing this together and that students actively participate in that. We have lots of other forms of service around the campus, whether it be the older students going to the playground in the pre-prep to supervise playtime, for example, or reading stories. It could be that you've got students who are hedge laying, so helping create kind of hedge plants. And again, all of that work needs to be done. We don't do it because we're trying to save labour costs, because actually for the supervision and the training, then actually it's kind of cost neutral. Yeah. But we do it because we think it's important for them. So that's within the school community. Beyond the school community, then we do all sorts of different things. So students volunteer in local charity shops. Students do, particularly through the Duke of Edinburgh Award programme, they'll participate in a lot of service in different parts of the community. We have students who work with particularly a couple of local charities. We have a partnership with a charity called the Rural Refugee Network, and we will host students, young people who are refugees, coming to our campus to do various activity days. We also work with a local special needs charity that focuses particularly on young people and adults with autism spectrum challenges. And again, we'll either go there or they'll come here and we'll support them. So that's just a couple of examples of the kind of thing we do. But there are very, very many of them, and it's difficult to say do justice to all of those different things that are happening.
It's good. So you have been there now about 4 years. So what influence have you had? So this is a kind of slowly evolving, continually maturing, system. I understand education is like that, but you must have had some impact. What have you championed there?
You sound like a school inspector kind of measuring my impact, which is I'm glad that you're holding to me account on that. I mean, you're right to say that. I mean, one of the things that I'm still getting my head around is actually how you can measure that as one individual, even in this role, I have an impact. I mean, I think a lot of your role as a head teacher is tone setting and horizon scanning, and then kind of taking lots of ideas and then going, okay, well, I think we're all going in this direction. So last September, we launched a 10-year strategic plan, and that was very specifically designed to be longer term in its scope. So much of planning and development within education and other kind of services or organizations or industries is too short term. So you'll find most schools will have maybe a 1-year plan or a 3-year plan, or sometimes a maximum of a 5-year one. But if you really want to be both ambitious, but also organically healthy and stable in your growth, you actually need to think in a longer time frame. It gives you greater scope to think ambitious plans, but it also gives you greater scope to make sure you get it right first time, rather than rushing it through and realizing that actually, oh goodness, we got that wrong. Sorry, students who had to experience that, but next year will be better. I think there's too much at stake really to take those kind of risks. And so some of the things that we formulated in that plan are in relation to, for example, our bursary students. So we're looking to double the number of students who are on fully free places, what we call transformational bursaries. Very much part of our sort of charitable status, because we are a UK registered charity. But we also know that this is an education that is very hard to find in other educational contexts. And so for us, that's something which we think is important to offer for the students for whom it's really going to fit. We're also, as has been kind of trailed quite a lot in the press, and you mentioned at the start of this conversation, moving away from the kind of 50-50 GCSE and our own curriculum model at kind of Key Stage 4, so 14 to 16 education, to a 2 GCSE model. And that will happen gradually over the next 5 years. And that was work I did even before I came to Bedales, when I was at Latimer. But now that's work that I'm kind of, a lot of the legwork is not done by me, obviously, but that is something obviously that I have kind of pushed through. And then I suppose the other thing really, you talk about influence, and this is where, while there are questions in the UK currently about the status or the existence of the independent private sector in education, and there are definitely moral questions that the sector has to answer. For me, having worked both in the state and the private sector, I feel that the independent sector in the UK has a place in terms of being able to develop models of education, which can then be scaled up in a more economically efficient way within the state sector or in other educational contexts as well. We have freedoms that you will never have, even in the best funded and the most autonomous state system. And so we can be of benefit by sharing our experiences with other colleagues, particularly in the state sector. And so one of the things that, but also we, and in some ways I'm merely the spokesperson for this organization, what we do is a lot of advocacy within education. So within the last 12 months, we've given evidence to 3 separate parliamentary committees on education. And are mentioned multiple times in the reports that came out of those 3 different kind of parliamentary groups. looking at reform to education, either for 11 to 16-year-olds or for creative education or for curriculum and assessment. And we're really excited for the launch of the recently kind of trailed government announcement to look into curriculum assessment. And we hope very much that they will see what we're doing here as something which is useful to them. And so our benefit is obviously not just to our students, but we aim for our educational benefit to be of use to all of, potentially to, all or many young people. And not only just in this country, because we know that actually high stakes standardized assessments are very popular at the moment in education, in lots of educational systems. But there are many, many questions that educators around the world are asking about the validity and the usefulness of that. And, even in countries, which, aren't necessarily kind of Western democracies or whatever, even in places like India, you look at the stresses on the public examination system for the civil service, for example, or for universities, which determines so much about jobs. And they're so high stakes, that system is creaking. It was the same in Bangladesh. And that has led to, I think, that was one of the reasons why there's been a change of leadership at the top of government in Bangladesh. So there are huge questions being asked about high stakes assessments, and rightly so. And we're happy to be part of that. And we do have a track record in doing something different and having a demonstrable set of outcomes rather than just us talking about ideas.
Yeah. Let's take a quick commercial break. I just want to take a second and do a plug for the human intelligence movement. No, this is not a paid advertisement. I'm a member of the movement and a supporter. And the mission of the human intelligence movement is to ensure that all students have the skills to thrive and succeed in a world with AI. So join the movement. There's a link in the show notes. Let's continue where we left off here with Will talking about influence. And I love that he's so humble and, about his own influence there, his impact, yet he's incredibly thoughtful and holistic in his view of the education in general and the school's place within the broader community. So in the second half of the conversation, we take this even further now and talking about the impact they're having across England and their outreach now to share what they're doing across the larger global community, really. And and they're looking for ways to share what they're doing that advances education in the 21st century. So keep listening. No, this is great. This is actually why I do the show, right? Is to get this kind of information out so people realize there are folks that have found alternatives that work. And what they're doing or what you're doing may not work exactly for them, but there may be some pieces, some components of it that you can look at and go, yeah, we could move in that direction. We could find a path forward, along a different line. So actually, and some of what you've been talking about also reminds me a little bit of Singapore. So I don't know if you have studied or taken a close look at what Singapore does. Of course, quite often in the reports that come out globally comparing schools, Singapore keeps appearing at the top. Now, it's a very unique environment. A small little island nation there, maybe easier to kind of control. But I did do an episode with a guy who had been in the Singapore school system all the way up through, principal and whatever for like 30 years. And it was a really, really amazing discussion about their willingness to evolve, right? And they still have standardized kind of high pressure exams, but they've done a tremendous amount to kind of work around that and try and level the playing field and, give everybody an opportunity to be successful at that. But one of the things they've also done that I thought was very encouraging was they kind of they recognize that not everybody, and you kind of commented on the maturity difference thing, right? Not everybody learns at the same pace and is ready to take an exam like that at the same time, right? So they've added some flexibility in there to when you have to go take that, right? Take it when you're ready. And teachers can actually overrule the assessment's outcome. So if, you didn't test well, but the faculty really feels you have the potential, you just didn't test well, they can pass you up in the system anyway. And so it puts a little less pressure on a student to just go, oh, this is win or lose. If I don't do well on this assessment, I'm my future is closed to me. And so they've done a lot of work around that. And of course, I'm in Hong Kong, where you still have these, make or break tests. And every year we see students celebrating and students, devastated, crying because, they got their scores back and it wasn't what they needed for the, programs they want to get into. And so yes, we have been encouraging everybody to look at this and think about alternatives and how do we do better than these high stakes assessments. So cool.
Yeah, no, I mean,
yeah,
it's funny you should mention Singapore. I was just in April 2020, I was due to fly out to Singapore to have various meetings with the Ministry of Education there and visit various schools there in the state system and a couple of independent schools as well, precisely because of that innovation, and especially focusing on part of their system, which is called the integrated program, which is where for the students who they know are on a track towards A-levels, because they still sit A-levels in Singapore, and then onto particularly kind of academic theoretical university pathways, then they don't do O-levels. O-levels are still within the state system, I believe, or certainly they were then. And that was one of the massive inspirations to say, we don't need to do GCSEs for students who are on a certain pathway. Now, that's not a pathway for every young person, but again, this idea of different pathways for different young people is actually a more equitable way of running education than a one-size-fits-all, which actually is really uncomfortable for at least 50% of the population, especially when you're using norm referencing, which creates the bell curve, where you have to have students who are failing in order for other students to pass.
Yeah.
And that kind of paradigm is excessively mathematically or algorithmically driven in a way which doesn't recognize strength. It is predicated on a negative rather than a positive.
Yeah. So I'm a tech guy, so I got to ask some tech questions. So you commented earlier on AI, and I do absolutely agree that, there's a scale here, and, it's not the be all end all, but it's also not evil necessarily. So how is Bedales doing with the adoption? There's been so many concerns about cheating or students using it to not have to think, or, so how's it going at Bedales with that impact of AI?
So I think, certainly when it comes to some of the pressures that push students to use AI to plagiarize or to cheat, if you're going to be blunt about it, come from particularly the kind of high stakes aspects of assessment. Now, while we do believe in high stakes assessments, and particularly by the time they're 18, that's a really good growth experience for young people. It really develops their resilience. At the same time, if you do too much of it, then there are just too many times when they can, or they are tempted, or they're under pressure to use a tool to help circumvent some of the stresses that they're under. So immediately you can take that pressure off and therefore reduce the chances of students feeling like they want to use technology to kind of cut corners. And instead, actually, you find that they will see that just as a tool which is useful for them. I suppose the other thing, in terms of avoiding the problems that you get with AI and plagiarism and things like that is that ultimately, if you know your students really well as individuals, and also you're creating more bespoke and organic forms of learning and assessment, which are varying and changing much more frequently than a standardized national system, then it's much more difficult for students to kind of cheat in that kind of particular system or play that system. In terms of what we're doing with technology here, we are just in the process of rolling out school managed devices. So rather than, we used to have a bring your own device approach, we're a school which is liberal, and so we want to develop students' ability to self-regulate by the time they leave us. We know that the technology is so powerful in terms of its impact on behavior and can be so addictive in terms of the way it's designed, that actually we need to support our students more carefully by limiting the amount that the technology can draw them in. and for us to be able to kind of help them find that balance. By the time they leave us, then for the last 2 years they can have their own device, which isn't necessarily as regulated, although we obviously continue to do things like internet filtering and things like that. But it is very much a gradated process, and a process which then enables them to go out into the world knowing where these tools are useful and powerful, but also to know when they're not, or when they're dangerously addictive, or kind of take you down wormholes and all the rest of it. And helping students understand that balance is a process which will have to be involving trial and error, and does have to involve actual using of the tech. If you ban the tech completely, then you don't give them the opportunity to learn. What you've got to do, though, is have tech where you as a school can kind of see what's happening under the bonnet, can help support young people, not through in a kind of Orwellian Big Brother approach, but through a way which is just kind of stripping out some of the white noise that you find in devices. We are still in early adoption phase, and until we know what these tools can do, what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are fully, then there is a lot of kind of fluidity there. Hence the kind of tech scare versus kind of tech evangelist kind of dichotomy we find at the moment. But as with everything we do, it's trying to chart that middle way. So we do use AI sometimes in lessons. I'm an English teacher, and I still teach our first year's English for half a term, so I get to teach the whole cohort all the way through. And we were doing a short story by an author called E.M. Forster, and there aren't really any materials on it because it's quite an obscure short story. So I got an AI tool to write a short kind of factual test, because I'd asked them to go away and read it, and then I just wanted to check their basic knowledge of what happens in the story. And so it was just a 10-mark multiple choice question test, and it came up with 7 questions which were spot on. 3 of the questions, though, were not spot on. 1 was completely inaccurate because it had failed to understand something which was metaphorical. 1 was ambiguous, and then 1 was just kind of not very helpful as a question in terms of understanding. So I changed 3 of the questions, kept the 7. The class did the test not knowing it had been created by AI, but then once they'd done the test, the second part of the lesson was, okay, now let's look at the test. Let me show you the questions as they were when they came out, which were the ones that I changed and why. What do we learn about AI tools and the difference between an AI tool and a human brain? And so, teachers are using it in different contexts when it's useful, either to help them spend more time in human interactions with their children rather than doing laborious mechanical tasks, or we're using it to kind of essentially augment what we know people can do and help them go further. But that has to be subject specific and age specific, and it's because of the nature of these tools, it's constantly evolving. We also need to be careful about the environmental impact, for example, in terms of excessive use of powerful AI tools. Although, again, I think hopefully the kind of carbon footprint of things like AI will diminish.
Yeah. So where do you go to learn about AI and to write policy around this? Are there organizations that you look to?
Especially, again, with that fluidity, even governments are still scrabbling around to formulate stuff. There's only just become, they're only just looking at treaties into this kind of thing. And again, we're still very much in a fluid time. So you've got to look far and wide. So I was at the Hay Book Festival on the Welsh-English border in the summer. It's quite a well-known literary festival. And there was a speaker who has had a very interesting career, both working in Silicon Valley, but also working for government, looking at both the advantages of tech, but also some of the legislative issues around it and some of the ethical issues around it. So going to her talk, buying her book, I've got a conversation with her in a couple of weeks' time. Those are things which can inform me on a conceptual level. We'll look at what other schools do, both in the UK and elsewhere. We'll look at kind of cutting edge research. So there's some really interesting research coming out of particularly places like Cambridge University, the Blakemore Lab, which focuses particularly on adolescent neuroscience and development, has a particular focus on social media. And there's some really interesting academics there who are doing exploratory stuff. The interesting thing, though, whenever you talk to anyone is that no one has a definitive answer. And that's where sometimes as a school leader, you just have to make a decision. And you can be as informed as you like, but you won't necessarily get, longitudinal data which backs up your decision. because that longitudinal data doesn't exist, because things are still so fluid that nothing is stable yet, that you can do a 5-year sample or a 10-year sample.
Yeah. Well, I'll agree with that. I mean, everything's changing rapidly. I am curious if, and I'm not sure who you were referring to there, but do you know who Dr. Rose Luckin is?
Yeah, I've come across some of the things that she does. The person I was talking to was someone called Verity Harding. And she's written a book which is just there called AI Needs You. It's on my shelf there. And that's a really interesting book in terms of maybe some of the more kind of philosophical and ethical ideas behind AI. And the challenges with an industry which is very, very dominated at the moment by a very specific demographic, particularly in Silicon Valley. And, you know, for a woman to be talking about AI just in itself, it is an unusual perspective. And so it's about trying to find a more balanced set of voices, and for us to just unpick some of the paradigms, the ways of thinking that have been built into some of the algorithmic kind of structures, for example, but even going further back in terms of just hardware and the foundation of the internet. You know, the origins of the internet are quite interesting in terms of the fact that, you know, it was essentially a military project, and, you know, we have to think carefully about what that means.
Yeah. Yeah. No, cool. Well, and not to over endorse, I have had the opportunity. She's been to Hong Kong a couple times. I've met her, and she's been in AI for like 30 years with a focus on education and learning science. Truly I would say, a global thought leader, but she's there in the UK. And so, yeah, you might look for her. She's also got some books out. I've read at least one of hers and some papers she's produced. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. But I think she's got a good kind of balanced rationale around protecting human intelligence, which I think is really, really important, and distinguishing what's human intelligence versus artificial intelligence.
Yes.
But I certainly agree with you on the kind of policy-based thing, that there is no like model out there that you just go, oh, yeah, they've already written it, I can just adopt that for my school. It's problematic. And but a lot of schools haven't done anything. So from the leadership side, right, they've been fishing and didn't do anything, which kind of forced a lot of the teachers to go it alone. Kind of go, all right, well, I got to deal with this. My students are already starting to use this, and, you know, I got to figure this out. And so I think it's been quite traumatic for the whole education system globally of, yeah, folks trying to figure this out, and a lot of teachers having to do it on their own.
Well, it really does problematize a knowledge-driven education system, because it democratizes access to information. But in some ways, I do think that, I mean, there are some things which I think as human beings we should just do because by it being done by a human hand, it has different validity to that if it's done by a machine. It's like, I suppose, the difference between a handmade piece of furniture versus a factory-made piece of furniture. You know, there is something really special about craft, and that's something which is very much part of our heritage. And yes, it could be done more efficiently in a factory by a machine, but that's not the point. And so, you know, again, this kind of dichotomy, or it can only be one or the other, is a false one. And so often, you know, in education, you've just got to kind of make sure you're plowing a furrow between two kind of extremes, two dichotomies. Often when I'm formulating decisions, and we speak a lot with parents and students and staff, if I find that maybe 80-90% of the school population is largely happy with what we're doing, but maybe there's 5% on both ends of the extreme who are really unhappy, I mean, obviously I'll want to talk to them and help them explain, and generally they do come on board. But that's often a way of calibrating. Well, you know, if I've got voices on both ends of the extreme, actually that kind of tells me that the middle way is probably a good one. I mean, it isn't always the way. You've got to be careful about centrism for its own sake as an ideology as well.
So
yeah.
So it makes me think of another question, actually. So talk to me about the faculty. What makes them so special there? How do you find the teachers that can fit in this environment and embrace this progressive or liberal approach?
I mean, I think generally, well, human beings like autonomy and self-direction rather than just being told what to do all the time. I mean, I suppose that there is times when it's kind of reassuring, but that's quite limited. And especially when you're dealing with teachers who are thinkers, who are learners, who are in the business of growth, then, you know, growth requires autonomy for it to happen really effectively. And so an environment which encourages that is one which naturally draws teachers to it. Maybe not everyone. And there are sometimes where we have to make clear to people that, you know, we are not sometimes what people think we are. One of the issues about being a school like Bedales in the British context, and it would be the same for some other school systems, is that because the system here, at least on some levels, is skewed down one end of the spectrum in terms of, certainly in terms of the freedom versus authority or control binary, then people think that Bedales is a place which is a free-for-all, where there are no rules, where it's completely permissive. Just because most schools in this country have a uniform, the teachers are called Sir and Miss, and certainly for continental European families or North American families, it feels quite old-fashioned and quite authoritarian. So fellow British educators sometimes will kind of look at us and be like, oh, well, you know, just because you're not that norm means that you're kind of really kooky. So one of the things we have to do is to try and, you know, do a bit of myth busting. But actually, the moment an educator comes to visit here, for example, then it's amazing seeing that kind of eureka moment where they can see that an alternative but not completely unfamiliar approach actually is really refreshing and exciting. You know, it's a little daunting because, you know, when you can't rely on authoritarian modes of control and automatic expectations of obedience or compliance, you have to be a better educator. You have to have better relationships with your students. And so the expectations on some levels are higher, but actually, well, anyone who's even a half decent educator is going to want to be in that kind of environment because that's going to help them, you know, raise their own game. And so we have teachers who come here because they just have that kind of freedom. We have, you know, lots of faculty who stay here a very long time because they love it here, because it helps them constantly grow, and because they know that they're not going to find that in many other places outside of here.
Yeah. So what's the ratio? How small or large are the classes typically?
So in the senior school, then they on average in the first sort of 3 years, it'll be about a kind of 16-1, 20-1 kind of ratio, sometimes a bit smaller depending on the subject. And then for the last 2 years, it's more like a kind of 10-1, 8-1, 14-1 kind of range. So again, it is predicated on quite high staffing levels and low staff to student ratios, particularly because we want to get to know people. But there are schools, you know, there are a few schools in the British state system which do operate on a human scale. So the XP schools in the northeast of England, while the school itself has more students than just 500, they are arranged into units of 500 so that they can maintain the human scale, which allows people to be known and for particularly the students to know each other alongside the faculty.
Yeah, no, that's good because, I mean, I'm American, and I know in North America, it's much more typical to have 30 in a classroom.
And that would be the case. That's the same in the state sector in the UK as well. That's kind of normal. But I think, you know, even within that paradigm, even within that sort of size of scale and staffing, then yes, one way of doing it is being extremely authoritarian and requiring kind of obedience. Another way, though, is leaning into going, okay, well, we if we can't control everyone, or if we don't want to do that, okay, how do we do it so that we can still enable young people to operate effectively in that environment and to learn and to be happy? Well, you do that by empowering them and giving them choices and kind of devolving some of that responsibility to them. And particularly teenagers are capable of much more sometimes than I think adults credit them for. As long as you frame it correctly and structure the environment they're in correctly, actually they can do much more than we think. We still have a very Victorian attitude sometimes, I think, or a 19th century attitude towards young people. And I think that's really dangerous. They are young adults.
Yeah, I have seen plenty of examples of absolutely amazing things, out of some of these students. And I think most of our systems are holding them back. Somehow we got to get out of the way and let these kids go, because yes, they're capable of much more than a traditional system, I think, gives them. So kind of wrapping up now, what's next on the horizon for you and for the school, what happens in the next few years? You've got a 10-year
So
plan, but
yeah,
what's going on in the next few?
yeah. I mean, there are some kind of financial and political challenges coming up, but I don't really want to talk about them because I'm an optimist. I'm the optimist in chief. That's one of my roles I think of here. I think one of the really exciting things that I'm working on right now is working with colleagues to start taking our own curriculum, and not necessarily the nitty gritty of it, because as you said earlier in the conversation, it's not necessarily about saying what we do here in our context is exactly right for you in your context. But what we want to do is to demonstrate in a more transparent way to other educators in all systems, particularly in this country, but potentially more broadly, what our own curriculum looks like for 14 to 16 and how that works and how we've made it work. So, submissions, also to politicians and hopefully, being part of that conversation. We're also looking to establish a kind of study centre called, the draft name is the Bedales Centre for Progressive Education, which aims to draw on our really extensive archives, which have all sorts of fascinating educational material. And the history of Bedales is the history of education in the 20th and the 21st century. And as a resource for educators, for academics, it is a really useful one in the way that it's useful for us here in terms of informing us and helping us avoid some of the mistakes that happen. When you look at the history of education, it's extremely cyclical. You talk to anyone, like any faculty member who's been in schools for more than 20 years, they were like, yes, we were, where we are now is where we were 20 years ago or whatever. And so actually being able to see things historically enables you to avoid some of the mistakes of getting trapped in cycles or pendulum swings and actually charting more of a kind of middle way through. And so we're looking to establish a kind of university level study centre, giving access more broadly to our hosting conferences, doing potentially some consultancy work so that we can share our perspective and our approaches more widely and help upskill other people. We feel like it's been a bit of a dark ages in the last kind of 15 years in this country in terms of the approaches to education. We've really firmly been keeping the flame of creativity alive and cultural education alive, particularly alongside an academic education. And we know that there is a real appetite for amongst educators and kind of leaders of the country to change things. And we're really happy to be part of that.
Perfect. I love that. That's good to hear. That's exactly why I do this show, so we can share and the things we do that work and the things we do that don't work so well. Everybody can learn from our mistakes. So well, thank you so much for sharing and working through your technical issue at the beginning of the call.
Sorry about
Yes,
that.
no, I'm glad you were persistent and didn't give up and were able to join me and do this. So it's been fun. Any last words? Any comments you want to make? Anything we didn't cover you were hoping to share?
You've been very good, actually. You've clearly done your research. I suppose I just come back to kind of key things, which is that whatever the challenges we face in education, wherever we are in the world, optimism is a vital quality that we need to, or energy that we need to hold on to. And certainly the fact that you doing what you're doing are looking for people who are optimistic about change and education, on an international level is something which, we need to strive more than ever to hold on to. So I suppose that would be my final word.
All right. Well, thank you for your optimism. And as I say on the show quite often, bravery. I think we have to be brave in education right now and try new things. And so thank you for moving the needle. This is good. So Bedales, this just sounds like such an incredible school. Will does a great job of kind of telling the story and sharing about his experience there and why he came to this school. I hope I get a chance to visit the school. That would be awesome. I'm sure Will would be a great host. Listening to him describe how they, it's this freedom there. The students have much greater freedom than they might in other schools, yet they provide enough structure and individualized attention to help manage that. And I get why he says that teachers want to work there. Now, I also get that no school is perfect. I did read some of the stuff online, and the challenges they have, concerns raised about the about the school. And I can only imagine that the challenges around, a school full of wealthy, privileged kids who are given, additional freedoms. So clearly, Will understands those challenges and he deals with it, fairly and decisively, I think, firmly, maybe. So I love that he also recognizes that, change or reform, it needs to happen, but it needs to happen slowly enough so that, we don't break the learning, right? That we don't, students don't suffer as a result of rapid out of control change. We don't need to change for the sake of change, but as Will points out, the work that Bedales is doing doesn't necessarily work, at other schools, but it's still great to share what they're doing so others can glean from it, what may work in their context. Okay, that's a wrap for this episode with Will Goldsmith and our discussion about Bedales School. You made it to the end. Yay! Well done. I know this was a long one, but please subscribe if you haven't done that already, and please share with anyone else you know who would be interested in these kind of discussions about education. I'm Eric Byron. Thanks for listening to the Education Innovators podcast, and thanks to all those education innovators out there. You are making a difference.